Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. How are you, Mouin? How are you doing?
Hi Nasim, great to be with you again. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. With this show going to be published on the 30th of December, I thought we'd do a review this week instead of spending the time discussing the events of the past week. I thought, as this is going to be the last show of the year, we'd review the past year.
Hmm.
Assessing Israel's war of annihilation in Gaza, look at Zionism itself through a historical lens, and also the Palestinian resistance through a historical lens, and just provide an assessment of where we are. And we'll also, of course, take a look at the regional issue, how that may impact on the Palestinian cause and the region at large. So that's what I wanted to do today. Get your
Sounds good.
thoughts on some of the key events of the year
Yep.
through a historical lens, and also look forward to 2025. What are the key issues that we should keep an eye out on? So, with that said, we've seen Israel carry out a war of annihilation in Gaza over the past year. Um, and I just want to get a sense of your assessment of the aim Israel set out for itself at the beginning and where we are now currently. Has Benjamin Netanyahu strategy of mass killing and starvation achieved its objective, or has it not? I mean, what are your thoughts on just generally of the aims Israel set itself out and where we are at the moment?
Well, I think it's important at the outset to say that there are both declared, semi-declared, and undeclared aims. And then in addition, there are aims that Israel has that are specific to the Gaza Strip, more broadly to in relation to the occupied territories and the question of Palestine, and then regional aims. But I'll try to focus specifically on the Gaza Strip. I think there are a few takeaways here that are important. The first is that with this Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip now in its 15th, 16th month, it's pretty much Israel's longest war, and it's one being fought against Israel's weakest enemy in the smallest territory on its boundaries, and one that it has already controlled for over half a century. So, judged by that criteria, it's almost as if, anything that Israel can and will achieve from today forwards is not going to be able to restore its reputation that it considers an important strategic asset for military invincibility. Not only did Israel suffer what most Israeli analysts would describe as the most severe and consequential intelligence failure on October 7th of 2023, but over a year and a half after it proclaimed that it was going to eliminate Hamas as a military force and eliminate Hamas as a governing entity in the Gaza Strip, and to achieve this without in any way directly or indirectly negotiating with the movement. It is still fighting. Hamas is still a military force, albeit significantly weakened, where there is room for any form of Palestinian administration. It is Hamas that's leading that. And now, for the better part of a year, it has been negotiating with Hamas. In fact, it concluded an agreement with it in late 2023. That's the first point. The second one is that I think, as so many specialists and scholars, in addition, of course, to activists and human rights organizations, and even a few journalists and so on, have recognized, Israel has very successfully carried out a genocide in the Gaza Strip. And not only has it done this, this is basically a live stream genocide being live streamed by Palestinian media, by Palestinian citizen journalists, and crucially, also by the perpetrators themselves, Israeli soldiers and so on. Yet none of this has affected the Western support and continued military resupply and so on of Israel. And I think from an Israeli perspective, this total impunity must be counted as one of its primary achievements during the past year. If, and finally, I would just say these are all kind of, how should I put them, current assessments. Of course, much will depend on, if this ends, when it ends, and how it ends, and what comes after. But so far, we can say that irrespective of all the Palestinian suffering, even irrespective of all the heavy blows that Hamas and other Israeli adversaries in the region have had to absorb during the past 15 months, Israel cannot legitimately be seen with its military reputation and its military performance strengthened from this entire episode.
We'll unpack some of those points at greater depth as we move on. But before we do, wanted to get your thoughts from the the Palestinian perspective. The Palestinian issue, of course, faced a number of critical moments throughout its decades, century-long resistance to Zionist occupation from the Balfour Declaration 1917, the strike, first intifada, I should say, 1936, strike against British occupation, which decimated the Palestinian leadership. Then we had the Nakba in 48, 67. There was the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, various intifadas, and so on and so forth. How do you see the current genocide and the current moment in view of the long arc of history of Palestinian resistance to Zionist occupation?
Well, I would make several observations. I think, first of all, the developments over the past 15 or so months demonstrate yet again that the Palestinians will never surrender, irrespective of what Israel and its sponsors and allies manage to throw at them. The preeminent Palestinian historian, Walid Khalidi, already many months ago concluded that during this genocide, Israel has killed more Palestinians than it has killed in the previous 75 years. In other words, since the 1948 Palestine War. And I think what it demonstrates is that irrespective of the circumstances, Palestinians will always find a way to return in the sense of once again making an appearance on the regional and international stage, once again ensuring that they are central to the Middle East equation. And whether it's the destruction of Palestinian society and its dispossession and basically wiping Palestine off the map in 1948 during the Nakba, the occupation of the remainder of mandatory Palestine in 1967, the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, or indeed Oslo and the previous Israeli military onslaughts on the Gaza Strip and almost 2 decades of blockade, Palestinians see themselves, I think rightly, in an existential struggle for their very survival. So, in other words, not only fighting for their inalienable rights, but for their right to exist. And in this context, surrender is for them not an option, and they find a way to keep reorganizing themselves and to keep reinserting themselves onto the international stage. That would be my main takeaway. The other one, of course, is that as in previous episodes, if you will, we have to ask to what political end. And I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but here again, the regional and international circumstances, the ones that made Palestinians believe that they had to choose between, let's say, one last throw of the dice or a certain slow and anonymous death, also helps explain why the genocide has been able to continue for as long as it has, even in full view of, not only Israel's sponsors and allies like the United States and Great Britain, but the regional states, the Arab states, who have who have traditionally, expressed that they consider the question of Palestine not only support for a fellow Arab peoples, but also part of their own national security. And I think that's an important takeaway as well.
Hmm. And you mentioned the ICJ and the ICC in your initial comments, and I think at the beginning of 2014, January 2024, sorry, if anyone told you or I mean, you've been very skeptical of the ICC, as have many others, that there would be a response for Netanyahu, that the ICJ would be investigating Israel for genocide, and there would be a crystallization of global consensus that Israel is committing genocide, from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and all the major institutions and figures who study these things, reaching a conclusion that Israel committing genocide. I think we would have. We would not have believed that. We would have been very, very
Oh, yeah.
skeptical. So, is it right to say that we are at the beginning of the end of Israel's impunity? Of course, states haven't moved on this, but can we say that? And what practical impact might these developments have in 2025 and going forward?
Yeah. Well, it's a central question, and I think we should look at it in several aspects. If by impunity we mean that Israel is going to have to account for its crimes, in a court of law or a prison cell or any of that. Unfortunately, I don't think that's really on the cards. Just as no U.S. or British official was ever held to account for their crimes in Iraq, or indeed U.S. officials in Vietnam and so on. I don't see Israel or its leadership being formally held to account for their war crimes, their crimes against humanity, and indeed the crime of crimes, genocide. That's unfortunately not how the rules-based international order, as it's called, worked. It undermines and subverts international law, promotes impunity, and undermines accountability, depending on the skin color or the political flavor of the perpetrator. And for the same reason, I also think it's certainly possible, but unlikely, that Israel will once again become the pariah state that, along with South Africa, was during the white minority regime at the time in South Africa, that it was in the 1970s and 1980s, at least at the formal level. But having said that, it's difficult, I think, to overstate the importance, the significance of these developments that you're talking about, because they have essentially irreparably harmed the brand name of Israel. It has put Israel on a path to ostracism in the court of not only international public opinion, but also of Western public opinion, in a way that I don't think can ever be recovered. Um, and that's important for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, particularly in the West, you had many people who were perhaps not following it closely enough, perhaps felt intimidated and so on, and who felt a kind of license, if you will, a license to call things by their name after all these human rights organizations and international courts and so on began to identify Israel's war crimes and to indict Israeli leaders for perpetrating them, and so on. And secondly, and not less importantly, Israel, in contrast to many other states, if you compare it, for example, to I don't know, Saudi Arabia, some of these other autocracies and dictatorships around the world that are U.S. client states. In the case of Israel, um, public opinion is a strategic asset, and it has lost that. And in doing so, it has lost an important strategic asset that will deepen, I think, polarization within significant political parties in the West on this issue of should Israel be above the law, beyond criticism? Should impunity for Israel continue to be a central plank of our foreign policy? Or do we begin gradually to deal with Israeli conduct the way we would deal with the conduct of the other states? And I think over the long term, that is a strategic turning point.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to recognize that Israel's status as a pariah state has been cemented over the past year in a way we've not seen before. So, um, I mean, I remember Jimmy Carter passed away, so I wanted to bring this in. He wrote a book in 2006 called "Apartheid, Peace, Not Apartheid," and he got slated for that. Pro-Israeli Jewish community leaders accused him of anti-Semitism and many other things. And it seems like we've moved so far on from that moment where people worldwide accept the fact that Israel not only is an apartheid state, but also it's committed a genocide. So, what have we learned about the nature of Zionism itself, which we did not know, say, before October 6, 2023? What have we learned about the Zionist project that we were not aware of before?
Well, it depends on who you are. I think for people like you or me, we've learned very little that we didn't already know. But I think for many people for whom are either coming of age or know that there's conflict in the Middle East, but haven't really been engaged with the details beyond, a general interest in global affairs or whatever. I think this has been a real revelation. And you mentioned Jimmy Carter, who just passed away. There's a lot to be said about him, but let's just focus on that one issue you mentioned. When he published his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, I believe it came out in 2002. It caused a firestorm. 14 members of the advisory board of the Carter Center or of the Carter Presidential Library in Georgia resigned in protest at his publication of that book. That was only 20 years ago. Um, I suspect that if Carter were alive today and published a new book in which he devoted it, not to identifying Israel as an apartheid state, but rather promoting Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, and putting out all the genocide denial we've seen over the past year and so on, and basically talking the way many Israel flunkies do. I suspect he'd have at least as big a problem um, with that as he did 20 years ago with his book, the accuracy and prescience of which no one really disputes anymore. That's how much and how quickly things have changed, particularly during the past year. I think again, when you ask what has changed, well, I think again for many people, um, they view or have tended to view Israel, particularly in the West and particularly in Europe, they view Israel not through the prism of what actually happens in the Middle East, but they view it through, let's say, a moral prism, meaning they see Israel primarily in the context of the German Holocaust during the Second World War and view Israel as kind of a just and justified reparations for the genocide endured by the Jews of Europe during the 1940s, or they view Israel as, you know, through a religious prism and view the Israeli state as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, or you know, and these kinds of things. Well, um, those positions have become increasingly untenable for all but the most fanatic during the past year. I mean, it's you know, it's very difficult now to continue supporting Israel and justifying its conduct, its genocidal conduct, on the basis that it is a just and justified reparations for the genocide of the European Jews in the mid 20th century. So all these kinds of, you know, strategic assets that Israel had, if you will, you know, bipartisan support, the support of Western public opinion, these kinds of moral um, well springs of support are dissipating, and I think are long term are putting Israel in an increasingly difficult position where I think in the end it will, you know, and as far as global public opinion is concerned, it is already a pariah state, and that's going to have significant consequences. The other issue, of course, is there was significant unprecedented, in fact, domestic polarization with Israel on the eve of October 7th. I think that is only going to deepen in the years ahead, and that will have consequences as well.
I mean, despite what Netanyahu may say that he's recreated a new Middle East, is Zionism now more untenable, less viable now than it was not yesterday, not last year, but a century ago? Many before the creation of the state of Israel warned that the creation of a state for Jews only and establishing Jewish supremacy would cause nothing but violence and bloodshed. So, of course, many did not heed those advice. But would you say it's we are in a situation where it's less and less viable now than it was even a century ago?
I'm a little wary of giving a clear answer to that question because, you know, Israel, it's an ideological state. It's governed by the ideology of Zionism, and given, you know, the core aspects of Zionism, certainly as it actually exists, we're basically dealing with a 19th century ideology that was implemented during the 20th century, just as the era of decolonization was beginning, and has now, in the 21st century, transformed into indisputably a genocidal apartheid state. And on that basis, I think it would be quite logical to say, well, this is an entity that doesn't have a future, that is certain to, you know, collapse under its internal contradictions and so on. But having said that, it's always been my position that if you want to assess the viability of the Zionist enterprise, and since the 1940s, the State of Israel, you should look less at Israel and more at its sponsors and allies. And as long as they consider Israel a reliable proxy for their regional interests, or remain committed to its expansionist agenda for whatever reason, then I think it's quite premature to talk about you know, the collapse of the Zionist state, or to judge that it is no longer viable.
Mm. Let's bring this conversation down to more practical issues. And I've heard many people say that over the course of Israel conducting its genocidal campaign in Gaza, not many things have actually surprised them about Israel's conduct itself and its soldiers. But one thing that has surprised them is the level of complicity and the willingness of Western governments to continue supporting Israel's war of annihilation. Has there been anything that surprised you, knowing what you know about Zionism and the state of Israel? Um, did you find anything that's been shocking, surprising?
Well, several things. First of all, I think I've been taken aback, as I think many people, including many who know this issue better than I do, have been taken aback at the level and length of the commitment of Israel's sponsors and allies to Israel's continuing genocide. I don't think many people anticipated that 15 months on, states like governments like the United States, like Germany, like Great Britain, would still be so uncritically and unconditionally invested in an Israeli, not only, an Israeli war against the Palestinian people and annexationist government and so on, but an actual genocide. I think that has been a surprise. Secondly, even when Israeli soldiers, commanders, leaders are openly advertising what they're doing. You still have Western, I wouldn't call them leaders, let's call them senior officials, most prominently, of course, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his German counterpart, Annalena Baerbock, if I pronounce that correctly, and others, still face, the world media with an entirely straight face and basically start, crediting Israel for its human rights regime, for enabling aid and humanitarian assistance to enter the Gaza Strip and so on. I mean, this goes beyond mendacity, and I think that has also been a surprise. The willingness, for example, of the United States to keep massively resupplying Israel with basically an entire arsenal at a time when it is also, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, involved in a proxy war with Russia and anticipating the potential of a major conflict over Taiwan. This really is a level of ideological investment over length of time that I suspect few people could have foreseen. And I think we'll soon find out, to what extent is it a function of the fanatic devotion of outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden and his senior aides, and to what extent have we entered a new era in U.S. Middle East policy?
I mean, are you also equally surprised, though, the fact that Netanyahu did not travel to Poland fearing arrest in Poland? That some states have uh, taken a stance, though, be it, simply condemning the genocide in Gaza, and also Israeli soldiers being wary of traveling to Western countries as well, fearing arrest from pro-Palestinian groups who have issued who are seeking to arrest people who are behind the genocide. So has that also surprised you? I mean, there are shifts on the other side as well,
Mm.
although there are, you know,
Yeah.
blanket support for the war of annihilation in Gaza.
Yes, I'm not entirely surprised that, for example, low-level soldiers or junior officers are being warned not to travel abroad or are on occasion encountering legal difficulties when they do because they've so brazenly advertised and celebrated their war crimes on social media and so on. Um, that is not entirely surprising, particularly given that there's also apparently a unit in the Israeli military or the Israeli Foreign Ministry that is specifically there to advise Israeli citizens, including war criminals and so on, about the potential risks of foreign travel. Having said that, um, I was genuinely surprised that Netanyahu chose not to go to Poland, and ironically, he was unable to go to Poland to participate in a annual commemoration of the German Holocaust in Auschwitz concentration camp, precisely because he's so deeply involved in genocide himself. My assumption would have been, that given Poland's history, given the event he was traveling there for to Poland, that the Polish authorities would find a way to finesse this.
Like the
And
French.
yes, yes, but the difference, of course, being that Netanyahu never traveled to France. Um, uh, but on this occasion, it seems there were actual travel plans that had to be canceled. And I'm not quite sure how to interpret it. Is it the current Polish government trying to demonstrate that unlike its predecessors, it doesn't consider law a disposable phenomenon? Is it related to a sense that if even this arrest warrant is treated as meaningless, the ICC will soon cease to exist? Is it because Poland has been such a strong advocate of ICC indictments against Russian officials over Ukraine? It's difficult to say, but I certainly wouldn't have expected this development, and I think it's fantastic. Again, it goes back to earlier part of our discussion. When an Israeli prime minister cannot travel to Poland to participate in a commemoration of the German Holocaust at the Nazi concentration camp of Auschwitz, and was going there, primarily in order to weaponize the Holocaust as a pretext, of course, for continuing the genocide against the Palestinians. When it gets to the point where he can't do so, it again shows, that the moral imperative that many in the in the West for many years associated with Israel is evaporating. Um, it's a different world now that Israel is inhabiting.
I mean, obviously, we don't know what state Hamas is in and its capacity to govern. Um, and in the West Bank, we've seen the Palestinian Authority flexing its muscle, using its might against Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. Um, where do you place this moment? I mean, Palestinians throughout history, as we've spoken about, have had the capacity to reconstitute and uh, come together when at a time of adversity. We've seen that many, many times, whether it be after they were thrown out from Jordan, then Lebanon, and prior to that, a number of occasions, and also in Kuwait, for example. Do you see the Palestinians having the capacity to reconstitute their resistance in the face of this huge setback from what Israel has done over the past year?
Well, I think this is really one of the most important issues that Palestinians will have to confront in the coming years. Many leading Palestinian analysts have suggested that as a result of the past year, the Palestinian national movement, as we have known it since the late 1960s, has run its course and will need to be constructed anew from the ground up. And this applies, not only to the PLO and what has traditionally served as its backbone, as its spinal cord, the Fatah movement, but equally to Hamas. And I think what has been a particularly dangerous phenomenon is that in the context of the genocide of the past year, that the formal leadership of the Palestinian people, and here I'm talking about, Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian Authority, has become even more deeply invested in the pacification of its own people and has not raised so much as a water pistol to confront Israel, not only for what it's doing in the Gaza Strip, but for anything that it has been doing in the West Bank. It has finally launched an organized military campaign in the West Bank, but against its own people. And it seems that in this era of genocide, it sees its primary strategic objective as seeking to eradicate rival Palestinian forces from the West Bank. Um, you know, so given that, and given that division, and given the inability of the primary Palestinian political forces to establish even, a meaningful truce, if you will, with each other during the past year, I think this raises massive question marks about the continued relevance of the national movement as we have known it. But it's also, I think, very difficult to sketch out how, what, if anything, will replace it, how and when. That's something I think that we'll have to learn more about in the past year. But I think two things are clear that you know, um, any residual legitimacy that the Oslo agreements and its offspring, the Palestinian Authority, may have had on October 7th of last year, no longer exists. I think we will see in years to come uh, the growing relevance, once again, of both Palestinian communities in exile and of Palestinian community inside Israel in participating in the national movement in ways that has in fact been much diminished during the past 2 to 3 decades.
Let's turn our attention to some of the major regional issues. The big story, of course, is the toppling of the Assad regime. Give us an assessment of this major shift, including the weakening of the so-called axis of resistance in the short term and also in the long term.
Mm. Well, only a fool would suggest that the axis of resistance hasn't been weakened. Hamas has been battered in the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah in Lebanon has lost virtually all of its senior leadership and presumably a significant part of its military capabilities. The Assad regime in Syria, regardless of what one thought of it, and I think most people didn't think very much of it. It's Syria's geographical location played an important role, and that may well be in the balance now, depending on how things develop in Syria. And Iran has been directly attacked as well. But having said that, I think the kind of let's say, conclusions that we've been hearing that the axis of resistance has been dealt a mortal blow from which it cannot recover sounds to me premature. Um, there's no indication that the Iranian government is about to suffer a fate similar to that of the Assad regime in Syria. Of course, that was also very unanticipated, but there's also no indication that it's about to capitulate to either Israel or the Americans. In Yemen, Ansarullah, the Houthis have, if anything, escalated their participation during the past month. Hezbollah is very clearly licking its wounds and is in a weakened position, but is still there and is apparently and is presumably working full time to regain its capabilities. And as we discussed at the beginning, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip are still there, as they are in the West Bank. So, and then of course, there are always the unanticipated strategic developments. We had one in Syria at the beginning of this month. We may well in the next year have one somewhere else that will have a different impact on the regional equation. I think what's important to recognize is that beginning in the summer of this year, Israel went on the offensive in the sense that it appears to have regained the confidence and taken a decision to seek to fundamentally transform the strategic equation in the Middle East, with its attacks on Lebanon, Iran, bombings of Yemen, its extensive, unprecedented bombings of Syria this past month, and so on. And I would say that at this stage, it seems to me entirely premature to say that Israel has succeeded in achieving another 1967 in the Middle East, whereby its main adversaries have been crushed and delegitimized, and the consequence is that Israel's regional power has been kind of amplified and enhanced. I think it's such a conclusion at present seems to me quite premature. The only other comment I would make is that, we keep talking about Israel, the Palestinians, the West. The key part of this equation and a key part of the explanation of what we've seen during the past year has been the inertia of the Arab state system and of Arab governments themselves. And that, by the way, included the Assad government in Syria. Just as people were surprised at how long the West was willing to maintain its unconditional support for Israel's genocide, I think a key element here is also to understand that, in fact, the Arab states, for a variety of reasons, have done the same. And it has been their silence and inertia that has also been an important part of Western calculations in maintaining their policy towards Israel and the Palestinians during the past year.
Mm. I think the idea that the acts of resistance has been neutralized, it's not the case for the reasons you have cited. But also, I wanted to get your thoughts on something that's quite critical to the toppling of Assad. On the one hand, Israel presented this as something that's really positive for Israel, for its ability to neutralize its enemies. But on the other hand, you have Palestinians who also celebrated the toppling of Assad. So on that issue, there seems to be some kind of a alliance, in the sense that Assad represented something for both, which is positive. I assume Palestinians are thinking, as many are, that the toppling of Assad in the long term enhances their capacity to resist Israel. And Netanyahu probably thinks this was the way we break the back of the so-called acts of resistance. Can both be true here? I mean,
Yes,
because
I think they
there is.
can.
Sorry, go on.
Please, sorry, I interrupted you.
So I'm saying that's one of the reasons why the pro-Palestinian camp in the West has been divided somewhat. Some people think if Israel is celebrating the toppling of Assad, then it must be a bad thing. But then you also have Palestinians who see the toppling of Assad as a good thing. What is the calculation here in both their eyes?
Well, there are different calculations, of course, and I'm sorry that I have to keep, returning to the expression of premature, but I think that applies particularly in this case. Regarding Syria, there was no love lost between Israel or between the West and the Assad regime. And over the decades, there have been significant efforts to subvert it and so on. But once the conflict in Syria took place during the past decade, I think a consensus emerged, including both Israel, the United States, and the Europeans, that their preference was a weakened rather than replaced regime in Damascus. And I think they were concerned about, what would emerge should the Assad regime be overthrown. And that's what we're seeing now in terms of this competition, between Israel and the West on the one hand, the Saudi Emirati axis, the Turkish Qatari axis. It's a new struggle for Syria. Now, from Israel's point of view, of course, it makes sense for them to take credit, for developments in Syria. It's a bit like all these Iranian monarchist exiles now blaming Carter for the overthrow of the Shah. There is absolutely nothing that Carter could have done to maintain the Shah in power in 1979. And similarly, I think we need to understand developments in Syria primarily in terms of what was happening domestically um, uh, within the country. And of course, foreign powers played a role. Israel's attacks on Hezbollah and so on contributed to it. But arguably, Turkey played a more decisive role than did Israel. And I think much again will depend on what happens. Will a centralized state in Syria continue, or what will be its position on not only Israel and its illegal annexation of Syrian territory in the form of the Golan Heights, but its expansion of its occupation of Syrian territory? What will be its attitude towards the Palestinians? To what extent will it be different than that of the Assad regime, which, like many other Arab states, sought to exercise hegemonic control over the Palestinian movement and to use it as a card in its own relations with outside powers. And to what extent will Syria fracture and fragment, even if it remains formally a unified state and becomes something akin to what Lebanon was during its civil war? Those and who will be the main regional and foreign powers that will exercise influence in Syria? Will potentially the Russians continue to play an important role? Will they be replaced by others? These are all unanswered questions, I believe.
Let's end the discussion by looking ahead with two issues. First, Trump 2.0, as many anticipate, Trump will start off where he left, which is to try and expand the so-called Abraham Accords. There's a possibility Saudi will be next in agreeing to the Abraham Accords. Do you think if Saudi does cave, or there are incentives given to Saudi Arabia in the name of, say, for example, security guarantees and other things, that we could potentially see the end of what is traditionally known as the Israel-Palestine conflict? This will be the end. It will be reformed and reconstituted in a different way, but the idea that the Israel-Palestine conflict is one where the Arab states are somehow in opposition with Israel, that phase will come to an end as soon as Saudi signs on the dotted line.
That's entirely possible, that you have a kind of a confluence of Israeli unilateralism, Arab normalization with Israel, and a new American administration that, even more than its predecessor, um, uh, gives Israel not only gives Israel carte blanche to deal unilaterally with the Palestinians, but also focuses on neutralizing any actual or potential Arab formal state solidarity with them. That's certainly possible, but other scenarios are equally plausible. One can imagine, for example, that the Saudis will not want to be seen to be selling the Palestinians down the river at this historical juncture, and will instead go for a bilateral deal with the United States that does not have a normalization with Israel component. It's perhaps possible that, Saudi's de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, having failed in Yemen, feels he needs to uh, achieve something significant for the Palestinians to consolidate his own domestic and regional legitimacy. To what extent will Israel succeed in provoking a direct U.S. military conflict with Iran? I'm sorry to have to once again say these are all unanswered questions, but I think much will depend on where the Trump administration puts its priority. Will it take a transactional approach to Saudi Arabia in the sense of wanting a deal with Saudi Arabia that offers the most economic and strategic advantages to the United States, or will it, at the expense of those interests, prioritize normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel? Will it try to temper Israeli aggression in the region in order to prevent a direct U.S. military engagement, or will it go along with Israeli plans? Those, I think, are the key issues we need to look for in the coming year as Trump begins his second term. And here, just as one last comment, I would say we should also bear in mind that, particularly where U.S. Middle East policy is concerned, continuity is often at least as important as change.
Beyond the policies of the Trump administration and Saudi normalizing ties with Israel, what are the other key issues do you think we should be keeping an eye on in 2025 next year?
Well, I think again, Yemen is a key issue, also because it has an impact on the global economy, and also because the Yemen war remains formally an unresolved conflict, which is now kind of in the midst of a long-term truce. Will the growing military pressure on Yemen potentially reignite that conflict, which could have repercussions, throughout the region? Another key issue, I think, is of course Sudan, um, uh, which has uh, which has endured horrific levels of suffering for well over a year now, and in which a growing number of regional states are now directly participating. I'd be very interested to see how Egypt develops in the coming year as it faces increasing domestic challenges, and how this might impact its regional role. I think it's a foregone conclusion that that King Salman is probably not going to see out the new year, and that Mohammed bin Salman will assume the formal reins of power. And of course, Syria. So much, this Syria underwent a seismic transformation just a few weeks ago, and it's going to take a very long time till we get a better understanding of what the new Syria is going to look like. Most Syria specialists I've listened to don't accept the premise that those currently in charge of Damascus, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its leader, Julani or Shara, not sure what he calls himself these days, that he will be
Ahmed
able,
Shara.
yeah, Ahmed al-Shara, that he will be able to successfully establish a new hegemony over the Syrian state. As a final observation, I would say always expect the unexpected.
Yeah, I think in addition to all those key geopolitical issues you highlighted, I mean, one thing I'm looking to pay more attention to is just how Israel's status as a pariah state plays out in the international arena, the division within the Jewish community in the diaspora and Israel. It's become
Yeah.
it's a major issue now. The division between them. All polls show that more and more Jews are opposed to Israel. More and more Jews in the US and the UK believe Israel is committing genocide, and also in the American right as well. How there's almost a civil war within the US right over Israel. Israel has become a major wedge issue, divisive issue, and how that plays out.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are some of the other things I'm very keen
Absolutely.
to.
Yeah.
I'm keen
Absolutely.
to. Yeah. So Mouin, I mean, it's been a pleasure as always. This end of
Likewise.
2024. I think we've probably missed one or two, but every week, I've really enjoyed your thoughts and comments on the key issues of the week, and
Likewise. I've
hopefully,
always enjoyed our discussions and exchanges.
yeah, we'll kick off 2025 where we left off. So,
Unfortunately, that's correct. Yes.
yes. So I'll see you again soon for
Thank you.
another Memo Week review. And also those who have tuned in, thank you for joining us. See you next week. Bye-bye.